Welcome to the Family Pictures Podcast. I'm Michael Branson Smith, and I'm here with Jim Groom.
Hi, hello.
And today, Jim, let's do this for you. Let's do this for Jim Groom. All
do
right?
it for Johnny or do it for Jim Groom?
No, we're doing it for Jim Groom. Let's do this for you.
Stay golden, Michael Branson Smith.
yeah, because we're doing The Outsiders. All right?
Oh, yeah.
As
That's tough.
An unusual family picture, directed in 1983 by Francis Ford Coppola, and it portrays the lives of teenagers from opposite sides of the tracks in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where we had the white trash greasers and the affluent preppy socias from the wealthier side of the area. And it's actually an adaptation of a novel of the same name, written by Susan Eloise Hinton, who went by Essie Hinton because at the advice of her publisher, because it was a story about boys and they didn't want reviewers to say like, oh, what does a woman know to say about boys, right?
Yeah.
And amazingly, she published it in 1967, right after she graduated high school, and she had written the bulk of the book when she was only 16 years old. Wow. And she's considered one of the founding voices of YA literature, right? For, being one of the first to honestly portray adolescence, drinking, smoking, crappy parents, fighting. And it was interesting. I found an interview where she described how one of the reasons she wrote it is she actually wanted to be able to read this kind of a story, right?
I can believe that.
Very much grounded in the social dynamic she grew up with in Tulsa. But Jim, why The Outsiders as a family pictures?
Yeah, good question. I think when we talked about it, interestingly, like our last film Vacation, it's 1983. So we're on the theme of a year. But I think more than that, it kind of pulls us into the unconventional family. And the idea that this is almost like, a Peanuts episode where the parents are never around, or if they're around, they're like wah, 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 fighting like Johnny's parents. They're nowhere to be seen. It's a universe of kids or young adults. And the absence of those parents weighs so heavily on so many of the characters in the book and the movie. So it's kind of a deviation, but I think all the themes we want to talk about in this Family Pictures podcast will come up in spades with this one, because it's a rich story, and it's a great film, and a lot to be talked about. So that would be my argument. What about yours?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's the unconventional family that still showcases aspects of trying to pull off a conventional family, like the Curtis household being the primary exemplar, right? And I think we're going to be talking a lot about the Curtis household and literally their house itself, that wonderful craftsman bungalow, right?
Yeah, totally.
So, I mean, a little more background of the picture, which is interesting. This literally launched the careers of some super famous people. We had C. Thomas Howell as Pony Boy, Matt Dillon as Dally, Ralph Macchio, whose performance I think I absolutely adore. He just is such a standout as the waif of a teenager, Johnny, who's been so abused. Diane Lane, Sherry, Rob Lowe as Soda Pop.
Yeah, great.
And Patrick Swayze as the patriarch, right? And the 20-year-old Derry. And then finally, just popping in hot here and there is Tom Cruise, a really young Tom Cruise,
very
Steve
young.
Randall, doing stunts right off the jump, literally flipping off the trunk of the car.
Exactly, right?
He's like, I'm good. Probably cracked my head open, but I'm fine.
And he's all jacked up, right? He's also all muscle. It's interesting to see him.
Yeah, I mean, there was a recent interview with Rob Lowe. There was apparently there was a lot of shenanigans on the set of The Boys in a hotel they stayed in. And Rob Lowe talked about sparring with Tom Cruise, literally with headgears and boxing gloves. And they were in the hallway sparring. And, you can tell Rob Lowe is a bit of a waif, right? He's like super skinny. And And Rob Lowe talks about it as like, oh, you got a shot in on Tom Cruise, and he felt so good. And then the next moment, he's like, then I was on the floor, waking up after having blacked out because he had gotten clocked so hard by Tom Cruise. He's like, his energy. I mean, you could see it. It's like there, his like energy that he still has, like jumping up and down Oprah's couch or jumping out of like freaking like off a cliff from a motorcycle. He's never been less than at 11, right?
And I think it's interesting too, like when we talk about all the stars, right? And there's a bit of a family bit amongst these kids, like just
Yeah,
all these young actors. And I
right.
don't know if you've seen it, but I think the guy's name is like Fred Roos, and he was the casting director. And he's the
Oh,
one
okay,
who
yeah,
kind of went out and got. There's a great documentary about him. It's like 12 minutes and about outsiders. And the way in which they did the actual like auditions is they'd have all the kids in the
yeah,
room and they would say, you now play Soda Pop, you now play Pony Boy, and they would
right.
just switch up. Like Emilio Estevez would have to do all those different things, but like it's amazing when you think about how many of these actors who finally made the cut went on. Like that year, Tom Cruise does Risky Business
Yep,
and All the Right Moves, one of my favorite movies of all time. And then, and then obviously Patrick Swayze becomes a gigantic star of the 80s and
right,
90s. Like, it's really remarkable. I mean, Matt Dillon's Matt Dillon. He does Rumblefish next. I mean,
right.
it's a remarkable cast and a family in and of itself where, Francis Ford Coppola plays like the dad figure and brings
Right.
them all together and kind of, according to some of what you've already done the research for, like creates a bit of a family environment where they all have to exist together. So it's an interesting, both the making of the film and then the film itself.
Yeah, I mean, he literally spoke about how he literally created tension between the Socs and the greaser actors themselves by giving the Soc actors more money, right? Like better per diems,
Yeah. And like,
better cars, and better accommodations.
and supposedly, like they played a flag football or a soccer match
Yeah,
against one another, and the outsiders had like the gray sweats and the Chuck Taylors and the
yeah,
outsider shirt, and then the Socias came and they had like leather shoes and like pimped out like like football or soccer like
yeah.
sweatsuits and like
Their sweaters, yeah,
and they had like
yeah, with their
leather for
V-necks.
their
Hmm.
scripts. Like he really was like pushing this idea of tension and the idea of like even to the point where I guess he would film them going around Tulsa like robbing like pharmacies, like going
Oh,
in there
really?
like and going like and ripping off magazines, and like he really wanted Matt Dillon to spend a night in prison, and like there
Oh,
was
yeah,
this weird kind of like really pushing these kids to kind of method
yeah.
act, if you will.
Yeah, he had made Ralph Macchio live on a day with $5, and Macchio ended up spending the night in the park
Yeah,
in Oklahoma, like sleeping on a bench.
I
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a thing that like it sustains. Oh, and the other one was even Essie Hinton. She was there the whole time too, and you know Coppola was really generous with making time for her. She described how like she was right next to him in many of these situations, and she became a bit of a den mother. And she even has a cameo with as the nurse in the hospital with Matt Dillon, where he's totally brushing her off.
yeah, he's like, get out of here.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's, I mean,
So
the making of the film in some ways, and there's so much about it on YouTube, is it so much its own kind of family picture where they have reunions and
right.
stuff, and then there's the film itself.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Rob Lowe definitely he speaks of like the enduring relationships he's had with Tom Cruise and um, C. Thomas Howell in particular. And it's also interesting to see this carry over. Like, I mean, at some point, Family at War is coming with Red Dawn, and you see Patrick Swayze takes this role on again as a patriarch, right? With his actual
Absolutely.
brother played by Charlie Sheen, and C. Thomas Howell comes back as the second brother this time, right? and they have this assemblage of a family that must coexist. And the guy who plays Randy is also, he plays Daryl. He's the son of the Darren Dalton. He plays the son of the mayor in Red Dawn too. So
Good
three of those
call.
actors come
That's
back
right.
in Red Dawn, and you recreate the situation though. At least Daryl briefly is not a Socian though until he fucking,
Yeah, he
he
kind of becomes
does.
a Soch in that
He
one
does
too.
because he's a traitor,
Red
and
Dawn is another great
C. Thomas
family
Howell just like
movie.
fucking guns him down, man.
Yeah,
It's the
C.
best.
Thomas Howell. He kind of C. Thomas Howell is interesting. So you got this one where he's Pony Boy, and then that one where
Yeah,
he drinks the deer blood and he's kind of
yeah,
psycho. And then it
yeah.
goes back to him in The Hitcher in '87,
Right. Oh
where
yeah.
where freaking
But
Rutger
that is not a
Hauer
family
just
movie.
slaps him around. It's
Yeah,
so
yeah,
good. No,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
not a family movie.
No, not a family picture show. And speaking of this, I actually watched this with my family. It was my son was home from college, and my daughter and I was like, and my wife, we all watched it together, and that which was kind of cool because there's rare. It's like, oh, this is worth watching. And one of the things was, I realized like I probably had not seen this film since I was a teenager, probably on VHS in the '80s, and apparently, the version I watched is the kind of re-edited the complete novel version, right? And it has a number of scenes that weren't an original film. Because I
Oh,
remember being like, man, I do not remember that courtroom scene at all, right, from the original film. And I don't remember, Soda Pop and Dairy and Pony Boy in the park at the end of the film, right? But I do remember the letter. But there was a few things, and apparently this was again. So one of the things that's interesting is the really, so there is a librarian, right, from
Fresno.
Fresno, California, the Lone Star School, that she in 1980. So the book was championed by librarians actually because it was a book they could get boys to read, which is really interesting in and of itself, right? And so she and a number of the students at her school petitioned Coppola to turn it into a film. And it was at a time when Coppola was not doing very well, right?
He's at his low point, right? Yeah. He's getting
And
sued because Zoetrope, they're trying to take Zoetrope away because he did One from the Heart, which is a financial disaster of epic proportions.
right. And so he surprisingly actually opens this package which is filled with signatures from all the kids. It was 7th and 8th graders primarily, and he even in the credits recognizes Joellen Misakian, the librarian, and premieres the film in Fresno at I think it was their high school actually, but and all the actors show up, and all the fawning teenagers are around them, which is kind of amazing. So
Exactly. Not
yeah, yeah.
villain.
And so, he again, and this is back to the point of like he did what Coppola does. I mean, in part of like Coppola is no joke. He puts himself on the line. He financed a lot of his films, right? And that's why he was in such dire straits with One from the Heart? Is that the
That's
film?
right.
Yeah.
One from the Heart.
Yeah. And it was
82.
yeah,
Or
it was a
yeah, I think.
bomb. And so he talked about how it was really common between he and George Lucas, right? When they were both working directly with the bigger studios, and they were forced to make compromises to shorten the film, probably sometimes for good reason. Like you never know. It's like it's kind of funny when you see the director's cut and you're like, man, I like the theatrical release. Okay. um, and
Exactly.
so, but he said that he and Lucas, they were like VHS heads. They were early videotape heads with Betamax and stuff like that. And they would save copies of their films, right, on VHS. The versions, unbastardized, like commercial version. And so these became references for his re-release. So I find that stuff
Which
compelling.
was
It's like just how they operate.
2005. And I'm
Yeah.
jealous that you got a copy of that because I watched the original, the 91-minute version.
Oh,
And that was
really?
that was the part I grew up with, the one I grew up with.
Oh,
But I had read about the 2005 re-release and I couldn't get my hands on it in time for this, which was a shame. But it's interesting that they re-released it and that he put it back because he got criticized when it came out by even some of the students and some of the teachers. Like it wasn't a really faithful version of the book
Right.
because those scenes had been left out. But he had filmed them; they just got cut because the studio's like, it's way
Right.
too long.
Right. And so he re-added them. And so I think we should, it's at this point, we should dive, like, to me, one of the most important parts of this is the focus on the Curtis household. So we should set up the Curtis household. So this is, they're living on the north side where the sun also sets, right? and
Well done.
and they have a pretty rough and ready craftsman bungalow that Derry, the 20-year-old, Soda Pop, the 16-year-old, and Pony Boy, the 14-year-old, living together after their parents have died as a result of it. We get the impression it's they were hit by a train while off on a picnic.
What an insane like visual in the film that
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
And it goes sideways, and
Right.
that is such a haunting, like, that's all. It's like, that Lolita where it's like, picnic, lightning, and that's the greatest parentheses in literature is that, and that's kind of like this train crash.
Sure,
It's
yeah.
so brutal, but that's all you kind of know.
Right. But though it's the three of them, it is also the center point of their, titular, their gang, the Greasers. Or the Greasers aren't a gang per se, but the Greasers represent a community, a larger community of the north side of Tulsa. But ultimately, they represent a particular family or household that includes also Two-Bit, played by Emilio Estevez, Steve Randall, played by Tom Cruise. And wait, am I missing the last? Is there someone? No, that's it. That's everybody. Oh, and Dally. Dally, played by Matt Dillon, who's kind of
he's his own thing. Like, he's at the
Yeah.
bar. You know what I
Right.
mean? Run
Yeah.
by
And
Tom
Johnny,
Waits.
even Johnny, sadly, who's in the most of Dire Straits doesn't, you don't really ever see him. Notice he never goes in the house.
No.
Right.
He
He's
doesn't
not
even come to
comfortable.
sleep there. He's like, if you
No.
get too cold, Johnny, come to my
Yeah.
house, before the whole scene with the fountain. But he
Right.
doesn't go.
And even in the opening scene, Pony also invites him to come inside, and he's like, nah. And he's like, "Are you going to go home?" And he's like, "Probably not." Right. But for everybody else, like, we've got, Two-Bit and Steve Randall, especially, they just like, this is our house too. Right. And they exist in that space as much as basically the Curtis brothers do. And, I think it's what's for me so endearing about the space is like anybody can be there, even though the place is a mess. Like, you see the torn wallpaper, you see like the cracked, like there's a scene after a Pony Boy comes home, right? And he's trying to cook breakfast, and the kitchen's like a disaster, but he's making a home of it. And then Two-Bit and Steve come in, and they immediately, start horsing around with him and make him lose his eggs on the floor and everything like that. And then they turn the meal, it turns into of like, who made this chocolate cake, and let's eat it.
Exactly. With a Budweiser.
With a Budweiser, like that is, and they're watching cartoons together, right? Playing cards, I don't know if it's playing cards because Tom Cruise is more like throwing cards at Rob Lowe.
Yeah.
And then it turns into arm wrestling. And so there's the horseplay, and it's a real family. It's a space where all these boys, basically are 100% welcome to be without reservation at any time.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because, there is that sense of like this family, and then there's the sense of, Darry, played by Patrick Swayze, who in many ways has, it wasn't his choice, obviously, but when the parents die, he, being the oldest, had to take on the role of the parent, or really the single parent. And all of the challenges that come along with that, like, Pony Boy kind of hating him because he always has to be strict, but, Darry really being kind of completely like in over his head and just wanting to make sure that nothing happens to his youngest brother. Or really, there's that kind of shift that you get this sense that this is also about like, it's not just all fun and games as we kind of see in that scene, but then there's someone above Darry who has to keep it all together and has to make sure they don't go to a juvenile kind of, foster home or kind of get into some issues. So there's that whole bigger question. And I think Patrick Swayze in that role is really great because Patrick Swayze at the filming of this is like 31, even though he's supposed to be 20. And it's
Right. I think he's
only his
25
second
actually, but it's
film.
yeah, it's oh yeah. No, he's like, and he's his physical self, the brief moment when he vaults over the fence as they're headed to the fight,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
like incredible.
And when
Yeah,
their
but the
shirts
single
are off,
parent
it's
thing,
like, oh
yeah.
my
And
God.
his my wife noticed that his belt was constantly open. He's constantly stuffing his shirt and his into his underwear, and he's like throwing his crotch around the house, you know.
Yeah. There
Just
is
like a parent,
another
it's like I'm the I'm the earner of this house. I'm gonna be how I want to be in this house, right?
there is another direction. I don't know if we'll take it of this film when you think about all these boys together in this house and like, many of them very, very good looking, going on to be superstars and
Right.
like, all the bodies, the shirts off, you know.
Yeah.
There is that part of this movie too.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely was an attraction, I'm sure, to many a teenager.
Yeah.
Um, and his role as a single parent, I mean, this is something. I mean, was raised in a single parent household, and it is incredibly stressful. And when it was a mother trying to have two boys and keep them out of trouble, right? It's a thing that can happen, right? And being extreme and not knowing how to manage, like, because you're just terrified they're going to just end up doing something that's not on the up and up, and it could just derail your hopeful goals for them, right? And it's very literal. Those hopeful. He's like, you could go to college, Pony Boy. You're smart enough. Soda Pop, he wasn't good at school, and he's actually perfectly happy to work in the garage. Like, he's like, I'm cool. But sadly, Soda Pop many times gets stuck in the middle, right?
Yeah, he does, and I think he bemoans that, and he doesn't want to play that role of arbiter between um, Pony Boy and Derry. And I think, when we talk about the home, like I grew up in a house kind of like that, like where it was a free for all. My mom and dad got divorced. Like my mom had 7 kids. The
Wow.
entire neighborhood was over my house all the time. We were out creating all sorts of havoc. In fact, one of the things that really struck me about this movie, like 2 things, if you'll indulge me. One of them
Yeah.
is like the fear of older kids. Like,
Right. Yeah.
like Tim Shepard, even Dally, like some of these characters in Outsiders are truly haunting, right?
Yeah.
Like they will like beat each other up, broken ribs, like they're pulling out switchblades, like they even maybe have a gun or
Right.
chains. Chains always seem worse to me. It's like you're going to a rumble with a chain. Like, how barbaric is this? This is Conan. So, like,
Yeah.
there's also like this is 1965, and like shit seemed rough compared to 1979 or 80
Right.
even. But like, so I had older brother and his friend who would torment me and my friends, torment us. So like, we got this gate in the backyard to hold our dog, Thurman, named after Thurman Munson, the catcher from the Yankees. And so it was like one of those big gates, that held in a dog. My brother and his friend repurposed it to become a prison for me and my kids. And we were playing war. In particular, we were playing Vietnam War because that was all over the place. And they would come in with cut off sticker bushes and whip us on the back to recreate this idea of a Vietnam War like POW
Just creating
situation.
the deer hunter scene, right? It's like
So
spinning the. Let's start some Russian roulette next.
so that really does, like, the kids in my neighborhood really would hurt one another like in
Right.
creative ways. But anyway, my next point, and I'll try and be quick. There was this thing in my neighborhood and in the school district, in fact, called like early fraternities. And so, like, these fraternities were called like Omega, like Alpha, Beta, and they were very simply named. But the idea was like, as a high schooler in 10th or 11th grade, like you would try and get into this fraternity and they would paddle you like they would fucking paddle the hell out of you. And like
Yeah.
literally like people would go into hospitals after they were hazed. And like there was this whole like problem in my hometown and many hometowns on Southern Long Island where, or the South Shore of Long Island, where they would have these fraternities and they had to shut them down because the hazing problem was so bad, kids would end up in the hospital. And that was
Right.
something my older brothers had gone through. I never had because by the time I came, but that also reminds me of The Outsiders. Like, you know, there was a time like 15, 20 years ago where being a kid was even harder than it was in
Yeah.
1982 or whatever. So I kind of always think about that with The Outsiders, was just how barbaric some of the
Yeah.
practices were around violencing kids.
Yeah, I mean, like there is the scene where Dally literally terrorizes three like 8 and 10-year-old boys. Like he takes their cards and's like, "Want to play 52 pickup?" And then not only that, he just like literally starts screaming at them and making them get out of the. So, I mean,
That's a
yeah,
great
and
scene to
yeah,
really like epitomize that.
but it also, I mean, you mentioned this idea of being um, kind of left alone by your parents, right? And it's for your parents, it's out of necessity. There's only so much they can handle. And I think, the scene where, there's the scene in which Derry kind of loses his shit and he puts hands on Pony Boy for the first time. And this leads to the running away. Um, but as part of that running away, they don't really run away far, right? They just basically go to the empty lot, and he finds Johnny, and they hang out on that car seat, right? That's in the empty lot. And they had already spent time in there earlier in the evening, and this is what got Pony Boy in so much trouble. But there's this moment where they're literally just hanging out, and the two boys, and this is something that there's two parts of this. One is this idea of being young and just literally staring up at the sky, and that was enchanting because there's no adults around, right? And you're able to just do this. And what it features among multiple moments in the film are these moments of intimacy between boys, right? That you would normally associate, especially in, I think, more modern filmmaking that's supposedly more realistic, you would think of between girls, right? And Coppola wasn't afraid. What maybe it's because it was with the pen of a woman that wrote the story in the first place. But the intimacy amongst them is important. And one of the scenes you missed, right, because you watched the original Vernon, is early in the film. Um, Pony Boy and Soda Pop go to bed, and they sleep in the same bed, right? Because that's not in the original film. I know that's an added scene. And they're just basically, Soda Pop is cuddling him to keep him warm. And Pony Boy is literally asking Soda Pop about his girlfriend and what's it like to love someone, right? These kind of intimate conversations you would more normally associate with amongst girls and girlfriends. And that's part of the remarkable side. There is all the horsing around like a classic boy culture and wrestling and beating on one another. But there's also this enormous amount of empathy and intimacy between them, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and in the book, so what I did is I listened to the book. So I
Oh,
wanted
cool.
to say, like, how good of an adaptation was this to the book? And in the book, Pony Boy, since his parents died, which wasn't that long before we're seeing,
Right.
he couldn't really sleep at night. So Soda Pop and him started sleeping together after his parents died so that he
Mm,
could go to bed. And so there's also that idea of him looking for a surrogate and having so many problems with Barry that he becomes really attached to Soda Pop as a way
right.
to kind of deal with, the horrific event of his parents being lost. And I think there's a lot there, but also it opens up all sorts of questions, like you said, of like, this intimacy that's throughout the story and is really kind of, you know, there's one moment really where you kind of feel the sense where maybe Dally, for example, is not a likable character. It's at the beginning, and we kind of didn't even talk about it when they're at the
The drive-in.
exactly. They're at the drive-in and he's taunting Cherry Valance, right? He
Yeah.
just keeps on taunting her and taunting her and taunting her. And he's kind of like being a real jackass. And that's the point where Johnny, of all people, stands up and says, Dally, get out of here, right? And there's this kind of moment of like, you know, Dally's obviously used to be listened to, but there's that moment of, you know, the deep intimacy between Johnny and Dally, right?
Right.
That's a whole nother, like Soda Pop
Hmm.
and Pony Boy is one, but Johnny and Dally is a whole nother one. And that's a one point in the novel where it's kind of, or movie where it's broken. And it's interesting that it's happening around, you know, these two socias, and that kind of sets the movie off to be what it is, right? That's the kind of almost the defining moment, because after that, the socias are looking for them, they find them, they drown Pony Boy, and boom, 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 everything else happens. But
Right.
it's interesting that that moment of intimacy at that point is broken, and at that point, everything takes a different turn for the worse,
Right.
arguably.
Yeah. I mean, which leads to, so, you know, the the homicide happens, right? Where um the socials track down Bob, and Randy track them down with their friends, and they start beating on both Pony Boy and Johnny, and in particular Pony Boy, because he, like, you know, insulted them, and they're literally drowning him,
What?
you know.
Well, you know what a Soch is? White trash and Mustangs and Madras. And they spits on them. I love that
Yeah.
line.
And they're much smaller, and so they're getting beaten pretty badly. But Bob is the same, you know, Soch that had beaten up um,
Yeah,
Johnny
Johnny.
earlier, and scarred his face. And so Johnny is like convinced himself he's never going to take it again. And sure enough, he defends Pony Boy being drowned, and he stabs him to death. Right, he stabs Bob to death. And this kicks off the where they go to Dally, and because Dally is, as you've said, Dally is Johnny's guy ultimately,
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
he wants to be part of the Curtis household, and it leads to, you know, and Dally is like a true, you know, person. He sets them up with money, you know, dry clothes for Pony Boy, a gun, and in a plan, right? He says, go to this place in Bixby, or something like that, right? It's in the country. There's an old church. It's got a pump in the back, so you won't need water. Go buy some food and just camp out and stay there until I find you.
Yeah.
Right. And this leads to, I think, the second household in my mind. It's like,
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting where they play house for this moment. And there's this wonderful, when they first finally come upon the church, and it's all busted up and dirty. And this is one of like 5 Elvis Presley tunes going. And it's called We're Gonna Move. And it's amazing, because it's like, there's a leak in this, there's a leak in this old building. Yes, there's a leak. And it's just like,
Not in the
it's this, like,
original.
right. You know,
Interesting.
right. And this is another thing, like, Coppola spoke about how it was his father who did the soundtrack, right?
Yeah.
And it was basically a rockabilly soundtrack the entire time, which is it gets tiresome at points. So when he re-edited it, he adds multiple songs, and including five Elvis Presley tracks. I'm going to give
Wow.
you that movie so you can watch
I
it. It's
need to see it.
incredible.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. And so it's setting up this idea of like, we're going to fix this place up, we're going to make it our own, right?
Yeah,
And
it's great.
sure enough, you know, uh, um, Johnny comes back from the store with, what is it, bread, 4 day, a week's worth of bologna, peanut butter, cigarettes, cards, and a copy of Gone with the Wind.
Gone with the Wind. I'll never go hungry again.
Yep.
That's awesome. Yeah, it is. I mean, and I have to say, like, there are some scenes after that, right? So you're right. Like, I love the kind of, you know, they're starting afresh. They have this kind of, and of all things, in an abandoned church, right?
Right.
So do what you will with that, you know, kind of overly symbolic, you know, setting. But then there's moments where Johnny and at least in the 91-minute version, where Johnny and Pony Boy are kind of struggling with the idea of what the sunset means. And that's where we hear in the 91-minute version, the first time we hear about Nothing Gold Can Stay and the Robert
Right. The
Frost
Robert
poem,
Frost poem.
right?
Yep.
But there's also this great, almost soundstage sunset that is
Mhm.
very reminiscent of Gone with the Wind. And you got to think that Coppola is having a ton of fun taking this, movie and then
Mhm.
kind of knowing that, Johnny loves Gone with the Wind and Ponyboy's reading to him and really playing with the two. And just another, I just think the film is amazing cinematically. Like it's so much. We talked a little bit about the fountain, the overhead shot of the fountain with all three of them lying down,
Right.
the moment where Ponyboy is kind of drowning or being drowned, and then the blood comes in to signify that that Bob has been stabbed by Ralph Macchio or Johnny, and then the other part where they have Johnny sitting there and that focus on both Johnny and Bob in the background. And you talked about, I was going to say rack focus, but I was wrong. Like that beautiful shot where both, Johnny and the boy he had just killed in stark focus is so amazing, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I just love it. Like cinematically, there's so much going on with Coppola's version that I just love.
Yeah. I mean, and you remember, like, this is Coppola. This is a man who knows, like, realistic filmmaking. Like, he's done two Godfathers and he's done Apocalypse Now at this point.
Yeah,
And these are very deliberate choices to, whether it's a melodrama or it's more like a theatrical play, right? There's an artifice at times to the dialogue, but he knows that he's doing this, and he wants it to feel that way. He wants it to be projecting to the people in the back of the audience in a way. And those are what are called split diopter shots. Those are really cool. Like, they're used in cinema. Um, and they create this line of blurriness between them. But yeah, the thing that's so, I think, important about that scene, where he's reading the poem, he's reciting the poem, Nothing Can Stay Gold, is this is where Johnny, I think, this is his moment of epiphany. This is his moment of, I feel like for the first time I know what love is. I know what family is, right?
yeah,
Where he's talking about, you help me see the clouds. This is something I would never have seen. You have to help Dally. I bet Dally's never seen this. And that's what he writes in the letter at the end of the movie,
yeah,
right? Even though sadly Dally's dead at this point. Um, and you know that that is something that's so, and there's this other intimacy with the cutting of the hair, right? This is something that is so a familial moment. Like, this is something I do. Like, I'm the only one who's ever cut my son's hair. He doesn't let anybody else cut his hair. We always do it in the kitchen, and he's always like changing what he wants, right? He's never let me pull out the clippers yet, which is fine. And so, there is something about that. And even though he's like, they're still being boys, and it's like, time to get your jollies when it's his turn. And he's using a switchblade, mind you, to cut his hair. It's
exactly.
not very
Grabbing the hair and
yeah.
switchblading it off.
Yeah. But this is Johnny's, this is the only, you get a sense like this is the only happiness he's ever had in his life, is this brief liminal moment in that house of the church, right? And it's
Yeah.
I know it is a metaphor, I guess, of some sort, but
Well, an abandoned church, right? Like,
yeah,
without anything else, without the Holy Family, this is all you have, right?
right. And this is when, soon after, eventually, Dolly does show up, and they go get food at the local Dairy Queen, and Dolly's talking about how he's like tricked everybody that they're headed to Texas, and even Two-Bit is like thinking of going to Texas to go find him. And these are all these moments. This is one example of these many moments that of what I think is kind of the ultimate theme of this, is that remembering the family that you make, right? It's not the family that you were born with. And there's all these ways that, even though they're boys, they call each other out, or they defend each other, right? Reminding you who your family really is. And in this moment, because it's Dolly and because it's Johnny, Dolly's saying, like, what are you talking? Because uh, um, Johnny is saying, like, well, let's just turn ourselves in, right? I think it's the right thing to do. People know that it was self-defense, and he thinks it's good. It's better for Ponyboy to be able to go back to his actual family. And Dolly's like, what the hell? Like, your family doesn't even care about you. Remember, I'm the one who cares about you, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's also that moment where you realize, and that comes on later in the book, right? When after Johnny has been burnt. And there's that kind of sense of, will Johnny's parents come back? But the idea early on, before all this moment, where Johnny doesn't even want to go home that night because his parents are fighting. And there's this idea of like, I mean, most kids maybe remember when their parents are fighting and how far they want to stay away from that. And I really like this idea of like, he's finally found some kind of, domestic bliss with Pony Boy.
Right.
And at that point, he's maybe trying to bring, like, as we learn later on, as your point, Dally in with that, right? Because he
Right.
almost seems like Dally and him, maybe they relate so tightly, and maybe they are a couple, if you will, because Dally's gone through the same thing. He says in that point, "You think my dad cares? Think my dad
Right.
cares if I'm in a car accident or if I'm in jail or if I'm this, right?" And like he kind of really tries to deeply convince Johnny that, look, we're all you have. And that theme of like making the family you have, and it maybe doesn't have to be blood, but it could be the friends around you or the people who defend you, who are those intimate kind of relationships where you grow up with. Like, I think that whole point about like when you were teenagers and you had these really tight relationships potentially with other boys or girls or what have you, like those seemingly are the world. And I think this book and also this movie do a really good job of kind of, understanding that and laying that out. And we talked about this as being a kind of landmark of young adult fiction. And I think part of it is that, like, S.E. Hinton really captures that. And maybe because they were in high school when they wrote it, but like that is beautifully captured in the pages of the book. And then I would say in the filming of it, and the film itself does a great job just by all the actors, but also the way in which we talked about Coppola had done this. Like they had done a whole bunch of filming of these scenes on video before they ever did anything on film. And so the relationship between these kids was super, super tight. So by the time they got into filming, I think they probably felt like truly like a little gang of, closely connected. At this point, no sense of their stardom because that was all to come. So it's interesting to think of. I always like, and I said this at the beginning, but I'm fascinated about this group of actors in Coppola as a kind of family itself making the film, and in some ways kind of paralleling the actual theme of the book.
Yeah, I mean, they're not the Brat Pack holistically, right? But at the same time, there's literally some of them, Emilio Estevez and Rob Lowe, who
Sure.
eventually become part of the Brat Pack. But there is that continuity amongst them in the film, and I like how they police one another too about what family is at times, and um, Two Bit of multiple times like reminds like when Pony Boy is coming down on Daria, being like he's like being too harsh on me, and Two Bits multiple times saying like, dude, that guy could have been a soc, like he was gonna go to college, right? He was smart enough and capable enough and like driven enough to do that. Like we learned from the fight, between the sisters, like he literally played ball with this football with the socials,
he hung
right?
out
So
with the socials. Yeah.
exactly. And even when Dolly's being a complete jerk to Sherry and Derry, Johnny, even though he calls out Dolly, literally Johnny and Ponyboy both defend him. It's like he's our guy.
That's right.
He's our family. And um and that's to me a big fundamental of this film is like how they do this. And I think the one that always stood out to me the most is in the hospital. So after, Johnny is almost burned to death, he has a broken back, and they're speaking to him for the first time, and they're kind of traumatized by it because they know how they're literally like the perspective is from he's like face down and he's looking into a mirror so he can see up at
Yeah.
Emilio Estevez, to Two Bit and Pony Boy. And so the perspective is really, really warped. Like you're just like, and so that they're seeing the trauma also on his actual back
Yeah.
because it has to be left open because it's burned. So it's, but we don't see it as an audience, but we know they're experiencing it. And then we hear in the background that Johnny's mother's shown up, and to show how much Johnny like feels about that, his actual family, he's telling the nurse, like, tell her to get out of here. I don't want to see her. And he's so traumatized in that brief little moment that he literally like causes pain to himself and passes out, right? And then Two-Bit just like laces into his mother, and he just like, his mother tries to call him scum, like I'm his mom, and he's just tells her to go to hell, like you mean nothing, we're his family, don't you forget it.
Yeah. That's again not in the 91-minute version.
Oh,
Not that's
really?
yeah, that's not that was cut. And that seems
Wow.
crucial. Like, and
Yeah.
it's interesting to me as we talk about this, because a lot of why I listened to the book before, there was a full reading on YouTube. I was like, okay, I'm going to listen to it 4.5 hours
Right.
because I wanted to see how close the book is to the novel. And
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you now, with that restored version, it's probably like 1-to-1 identical. But even without that, I am really blown away by how good a job Coppola does representing this novel, and kind of taking, it's interesting to me, librarians who would be the first person to be like, you shouldn't make a movie, you should read the book, right? You would
Right.
think they're the ones who basically made this movie happen, which is
Right.
so cool. But on top of that, I would argue, like, the movie, it's one of those shining situations where the movie is as good, if not better, than the book. And so you start to get into this question of, like, should that whole idea of media, that in the 80s as kids, people were like, don't watch the movie, it's never as good as the book. I think
Right.
Outsiders is one of those points where it's like, I read the book before I watched the movie, and I still remember the movie. When
Right.
Dally runs over, a rebel's not a rebel without me, right? And crops in, and just all these kind of moments. It's like, that movie's amazing. And the performances are ridiculous. And the idea that, we're going to see in Coppola, between the Outsiders and Rumblefish, maybe I'll argue, but maybe I'm wrong, his two last great films, right? And then he goes on to do stuff like Cotton Club and Jack and, Dracula and whatever the hell Megalopolis
Yeah. I
Megalopolis
mean,
is.
he's got Peggy Sue Got Married in there, right?
He
Did that come
does.
after?
Yeah, but I'm not a huge fan of that one either. But
Yeah, yeah.
that said, like, you're seeing Coppola, like, who made Apocalypse Now, like you were saying, The Godfathers, right? Like, Conversation. Like, this is him, like, going into a different, arguably young adult filmmaking, and
Right.
just killing it. Like, absolutely killing the film. So I just love it because it also, it's I can still put this as a Coppola that goes with the 70s Coppola, even though it's 82,
Mm-hmm.
83 when he's making it.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to see, like, I don't remember the quote, but I know Coppola had a certain earnestness at that time about the voice of the youth, right? Like, there's a kind of infamous / famous quote about, like, he can't wait till the day that random young woman picks up a video camera and creates a masterpiece, because he really wants that voice. And so he's doing his best to channel their voice, but he's also really looking forward to the day when their voices will take over. And that's kind of admirable of someone who's recognizing, like, he knows his voice, even though, like, Megalopolis is a disaster. He can't help but chill, put his voice out there. But God bless him. It's with his own money, at least.
That's right.
Um, but he does
100 million of
appreciate.
it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he's very supportive of his two children, Roman and Sophia. Sophia's voice being a remarkable one soon
Yeah.
in the future. Roman has one film that's, I can't remember the name of it. It's a science fiction film that's pretty interesting. I'm blanking on the name, but this Sophia goes on to make, what is it, the Suicide Girls and
Suicide Diaries.
Suicide Diaries
The
and
one in with Bill Murray in Japan,
right.
Which I'm forgetting the name of. But yeah, she goes on to make some great
Yeah.
films. I mean, redoes
And
the
so
Clint Eastwood film in the South with the Southerners, like where they come, like post. Yeah, she does some great stuff. I do like her a lot.
Right. And so I think, I mean, this is somewhat close to, I mean, we don't really, it's the fight is the fight. It's not really so much about family per se, and so I don't think that it's something that would be fun to talk about because it's kind of amazingly choreographed and shot, and it's over in
Right.
less than like 90 seconds. Like talk about a set piece in like modern fiction, they would have dragged that shit out for like 6 minutes. You know? But it didn't matter. Like it's not about the family side, which is where we're sitting and more interested in, and so I think it's a pretty good place to wrap it up in a sense, and um, I like how he tries to frame the ending of this with, and this is the last scene where you don't get the scene, and so it's
No.
one of the final scenes. So it's prior to the reading of the letter by Johnny. We have Soda Pop, and it's interesting in the family, the Curtises, and he does this shot through the window of them having dinner together. And for a brief moment, it is like domestic bliss. It actually looks clean inside, and they're having dinner. Derry's talking about, doing homework again. Soda Pop's like serving dinner and about to sit down. But then Derry kind of loses it again. And he one last time in the sake for the sake of what happens next, he's describing how, and if you don't like it, you can get out of here, right? Derry says this to Ponyboy, and Ponyboy loses it, yelling at his dad, right?
Yeah.
And he tries to get Soda Pop to defend him. It's like take sides, and Soda Pop loses it. And for the first time, Soda Pop just loses it, and he runs out of the house. And Derry and Ponyboy run after him. And there's this moment, one of these final moments of intimacy amongst boys, right? And Soda Pop finally lays the law down, and it's like, Derry, you got to stop picking on him on about every single thing. And Ponyboy, you got to remember, Derry did this for you. He could have left us. He could have put you in a home, and it's not going to be perfect, but you got to keep that in mind, or try to. I mean, he's 14. It's hard.
Yeah.
And it's this, and they're once again cuddling and crying, and then they start walking home, and then they're just boys again because they start racing one another. And that's it. They're still boys, right?
Yeah.
And they're in this world without adults. And I love this family, I think, as much as you love this family. And whether it speaks to the weirdness of these spaces of teenagers or just trying to figure out how to be adults, what a film.
Yeah, it is. It's a great film. And again, that's another piece that's cut out from the 91-minute version. So that's like all of that is missed. And that's crucial in the book, right? So like, and I think it points out, because all the things you said that were missing from the version that I watched, the 91-minute version, the original version, just cuts out pieces of the book that would have answered the critics kind of, who's saying, oh, you cut too much of the book. In fact, he did a very, very faithful adaptation. And that's pretty cool also, because the book itself is great. And as you started, like, it starts off a whole new kind of idea of youth fiction or young adult fiction. And then we see the next film Coppola does is Rumblefish, which is another S.E. Hinton book. And then he also does, or no, he doesn't do, but another film that comes out in the 80s, which is one of my favorite, is That Was Then, This Is Now, which kind of plays off. It's another S.E. Hinton book that plays off of this theme of these troubled youth and the lack of family and how you're doing. And let's face it, in the 80s, right? And this is a theme we'll probably come across a lot. One of the things that is troubled is, we see the divorce rate in the 80s skyrocket, right? Like everybody has a kind of relationship to this idea of a broken home and to the idea of kind of being alone or alienated or maybe behind all this stuff that happened with your family. So in some ways, Outsiders, not only as a book, but also as a kind of film, is ground zero for a lot of that in the 80s. And it's a theme that comes up again and again and again. One of my favorite 80s films, The Stepfather. Now, think about the idea of The Stepfather in 87. That's a horror film, which is dealing with what happens to a family once divorce sets in or, once it's broken. And I think it's interesting because, to your point, this is a really lovable family, right? That has neither parent and has essentially been orphaned, yet they are still making it and making it in a way that, is somewhat really kind of not only admirable, but essentially like beloved, right? They're the kind of family that can, and Darry is the father that will. So yeah, I agree with you. It's a great film.
Well, we want to hear from you, the listeners of the Family Pictures podcast, of families in film that you would love to have us talk about.
Smash that like button.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it has to happen. I want to know the movies we're not even thinking of that we should be talking about.
I have to say, I don't care what they say.
No,
we're going to watch the movies we want to watch.
I want to know the ones that I've watched that I'm not thinking of, Jim. Okay, because I guarantee there's some out there.
Don't give them any power in this relationship.
All right. Well, this is the end of the Family Pictures podcast. I hope you listen again, because Jim Groom is not going to invite you to come back unless it's.
I don't really care if you listen. I'm going to be clear. I assume nobody's listening.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.